kind of got Hunter out of some legal problems, so we became buddies. And I did an interview in an article for the Village Voice, and then did a couple of interviews for Penthouse and Spin. And then the last article I did was published in Hustler Magazine. And then the December after that, I got a Christmas card from Larry Flint. So I was going, how much weirder is this going to get? I'm not going to read the interview, I'm just going to kind of read the introduction to the Vonnegut piece. And this interview took place the night before lounge. Some of you might know that in Lincoln. It was actually Vonnegut's 69th birthday. I was 27 at the time, and my brother was 25, and we published an underground comedy publication called The Great Red Shark that was distributed on college campuses. We also placed stacks of our publication in local book and record stores, not unlike this one. However, most of our reading audience would usually just pick up a copy of the paper at their favorite watering hole. After some lengthy negotiations, we got Vonnegut to come to Lincoln. Part of the agreement was Vonnegut would sit with us for an interview that we would publish in our comedy paper. His agent must have assumed that the interview would take place in a quiet restaurant or a hotel lobby. Don't ever assume anything. On the morning of his 69th birthday, Vonnegut boarded a plane in New York City, and 2 hours and 40 minutes later, landed at Epley Airfield in Omaha. He was standing at the Midwest Airlines terminal when we pulled up. He wore a beige overcoat and with a matching cap and had a single piece of luggage slung over his shoulder. There was no entourage, no assistants, publicists, wife, or photographers. We shook hands and hopped back in the car. Vonnegut rode shotgun. Vonnegut's lecture that evening at the Leon Center was entitled How to Get a Job Like Mine. He stood on a big stage in front of a big audience, in front of a big chalkboard, and pointed chalk at the audience members and explained and rationalized in a way that only Kurt Vonnegut could do. He talked about all the problems facing America: illiteracy, poverty, our dependence on technology, and subsequent lack of human contact. After speaking for over an hour, Vonnegut put down the chalk and proclaimed that nothing would ever be done to solve any of our problems. But try to be saints anyway, he said. What we really need is ordinary people behaving decently in an indecent society. Afterwards, there was a book signing. Vonnegut was courteous and chatted with the first several people in line. I leaned over and informed him that our interview was going to take place at a gentleman's club called the Night Before Lounge. The conversations with the remaining fans in line were noticeably more succinct. On our way out, I glanced at the hors d'oeuvres table and noticed that the invited guests had devoured the fruit and vegetable platters, but had barely made a dent in the cookie tray. I hastily grabbed a handful of cookies and wrapped them in napkins, and stuffed a few in my coat pocket and several more into my briefcase. I had paid $196 for the backstage catering. The proprietors of Night Before Lounge knew we were coming. I specifically requested that they reserve a table in the back corner. It was really the only location where we could possibly conduct an interview. We ordered drinks, and I discreetly pulled a cookie from my pocket. By this time, my eyes had acclimated to the darkness, and I thoroughly studied the cookie to make sure there wasn't any pocket lint, or rubber bands, or anything else attached to it. After the drinks arrived, I handed the cookie to Vonnegut underneath the table. This is all true. You weren't allowed to bring food into the establishment, and I told him to make sure no one was watching before he took a bite. When we initially entered the bar, the first thing I had noticed was a disco ball rotating slowly above the main stage. Now, for some reason, it sat motionless. I walked up to the bar and asked the bartender if they had blown a fuse or something, and pointed at the disco ball with my thumb. I explained that I was interviewing novelist Kurt Vonnegut, and that his work had been translated into dozens of languages, and I wanted the environment to be a bit more festive. I walked back to our table and we sat in silence. Vonnegut took a sip of his drink, and then something quite miraculous happened. Octavia, the club's most popular performer, hopped onto the stage. She stood 6 feet tall in her bare feet, and the disco ball started spinning again. I glanced at Vonnegut out of the corner of my eye to make sure he wasn't missing out on these eventful developments, and I couldn't help but notice that a light layer of cookie crumbs was starting to accumulate on the front of Vonnegut's sweater. He was sitting in his chair, kind of leaning back ever so slightly, So every time he took a bite, the crumbs would fall on his belly. It was a little bit distracting. I didn't really know what to say to him, so I didn't say anything. Between bites, he held the cookie underneath the table or placed it on his lap out of sight as instructed. I gotta tell you, this is the best time I've ever had on one of these speaking engagements. Vonnegut said later in the evening, as the scorpions rocky like a hurricane played in the background. Usually it is a university that sponsors my visit, and afterwards I am forced to attend these dreadful receptions where everybody is usually scared to talk to me, or they have nothing to say, and I usually end up standing in the corner, drinking fruit punch. Nobody at Night Before Lounge recognized Vonnegut, with the exception of a local clothing designer who had attended the lecture. She respectfully approached the table and asked for an autograph on a cocktail napkin. At this point, I clicked on the tape recorder. During the course of the evening, Vonnegut ordered 3 scotch and waters and ate 2 cookies. And if you want, I've got some photographs of that night.
Cookie crumbs and all.
And there's some postcards, some Gonza postcards, if you guys want to take some of those too. So, but now let's get to the reason why we're all here tonight. The release of Brian's new book. You guys probably all know Brian published a book a few years ago called Santhal's Mermaid Mechanics. And here's some of the blurbs on the back of it. I'm sure you've all read this, but Brian is the Daniel Johnston of the literary world. Weird auteur Brian, through seedy narratives and satirical vignettes, shines an erratic light onto the charming shipwreck that is life on the fringe in South Omaha. His new book is called Psychedelic Everest. Excellent, I've read it twice. Brian, he's also an accomplished artist and a musician. He lives here in Omaha with his dog, Tinka. Do you still have your dog, Tinka?
She's at home.
Okay. Let's give it up for Brian.
Yeah!